What's up, you team of bad savages? My name is Tom, and today I'm gonna react to Hitler's plan for USA if he would win. By that I mean if the Germany would win. I'm a history geek, and I enjoy these kind of documentaries. And I know during the World War II, Germany had a pretty strong naval forces, right? And like most of them were submarines. The Germans sink a lot of American submarines who were who were carrying like weapons and other stuff for United Kingdom. So let's jump in. Let's check it out. What was the Hitler's plan?
The year is 1941, and Adolf Hitler is sitting pretty in Europe. By September that same year, the German military might have destroyed, or was in the process of destroying, all that stood before it. Poland, the initial target of the military, was subjugated, and France hadn't been too far behind. Even Britain, which had bravely continued fighting, was on its last legs. Despite the inspiration that had come from Winston Churchill's famous "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, Britain's supposed finest hour was a long way off. If it didn't get help and fast, Hitler would have eventually launched a cross-channel invasion into the country that he spent more than 12 months relentlessly bombing as part of its blitzkrieg. Hitler was a chief.
But thank God that German Goering, the head of Luftwaffe, was not competent enough to set up the proper like air invasion first, to then set up the land invasion, right? Because Goering was like a big figure that could draw the right attention to the party, in my opinion, right? He was a war hero from the First World War. He was a pilot himself. He was a leader, a charismatic leader, but in the same time, he was not a good tactician at all, and thank God that he was not a good tactician, I'm not taking away from United Kingdom's Air Forces. They were also good, so they were very good, I would say.
Giving all he wanted. Western Europe was essentially his, barring some pockets of resistance. Greece and Yugoslavia had fallen. Even the initial invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 had been a massive success, with Kiev and Smolensk taken and German troops fast closing in on Moscow. If all had stayed how it was, sooner or later Europe would have been overrun by the Nazis. Hitler
also, Germans were close to Leningrad, right? They blocked Leningrad, but they didn't want to go into it, so they decided just to close it off, right, and start bombarding it, so that people will die from starvation and from like bombs. I've been to Leningrad. I know some people who have survived this kind of this thing, right? This blockade of the city, man. And these are different people. These are people. They have different way that they see life. We as a people who live in a place where there's enough food, there's no war almost, right? We won't understand them because that was like very tough time, man. And they're like very good people after this experience because they know the value of the life, man.
Was on top of his metaphorical mountain. However, a mistake he made at the end of 1941 brought him and the entire Nazi regime crashing down. He declared war on the United States. In December of that year, Adolf Hitler expanded the scope of his domination efforts outside of Europe and Northern Africa, deciding that then was the time to focus on a huge nation that stood across the Atlantic Ocean. We all know the story from there. Galvanized by America's entry into World War II, the Allies were able to fight back against Hitler, and eventually, Nazi Germany lay in ruins. All of this culminated with Hitler taking his own life in a hidden bunker as his regime collapsed in around him. But what if Hitler's war against the United States had turned out differently? What if Hitler had been successful in taking Europe and had then been able to turn his attention to the United States without worrying about threats closer to home? What would his plans have been, and what was his vision of a Nazified USA? To answer that question, we first need to dig into the fateful decision that ultimately cost Hitler the war, the declaration of war on the United States. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 a.m., a fleet of Japanese planes flying over Oahu received the message "Tora, Tora, Tora" from Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, and they attacked. An enormous fleet of 353 aircraft launched from 4 carriers stationed near U.S. soil, along with a pair of heavy cruisers, 35 submarines, and several other Navy assets. The attack lasted just 1 hour and 15 minutes. In that time, Japan's assault managed to kill 2,403 Americans, 68 of whom were civilians, and had either damaged or destroyed 19 U.S. ships. Japan's declaration of war, which was supposed to have arrived just before the
Man, Japanese, like, all due respect to USA, but from a Japanese standpoint, right, they did a big mistake. Their planning was very bad because basically they destroyed ships, but they didn't destroy the places where the ships are repaired. So US was able to repair ships that was not fully destroyed pretty quick. So it was a miscalculation by Japanese. And again, thank God it was a miscalculation by Japanese, because Japanese, oh my gosh, they were ruthless, man. Guys, if you don't know about the documentary, the squad, it's called Squad 786 or something like that, the Ishii squad, right? I recommend to check it out for you guys, because this is about a guy who was doing experiments on people, on the people that were captured in captivity. I think it's called like that. And he was doing medical experiments. They were freezing people to death. They were poisoning with the gas, and just checking out, like, just torturing people, like covering by science, but they were just torturing people in different ways. Man, this is such a horrible story. I mean, guys, check it out. Squad 768 or 86, something like that.
The attack was launched, but somehow got delayed, came during the attack itself, and finally it was official. The United States had entered World War II, but it hadn't entered into war with Germany yet. When the attack happened, Adolf Hitler was stationed at the Wolf's Lair, a dank and depressing headquarters the Nazis had set up on the Eastern Front. The lair was where Hitler stayed when he considered a Russian campaign that had started so brightly but had ultimately stalled. His promises of a quick victory over the Soviet Union lay in tatters as his troops were halted just outside of Moscow, a mere 5 miles away from the city's famous Onion Domes. General Winter was doing a number on his troops. The Nazis suffered around 750,000 casualties due to the cold weather in Russia, not aided by the fact that they lacked the proper equipment and even winter clothing to deal with the harsh conditions. Hitler had promised his army victory over the summer. The Soviet Union had held on, and now his troops were dying. His tanks and trucks were immobilized by snow, and frostbite was ravaging those who hadn't already succumbed to the harsh Russian winter. It was as he contemplated what proved to be the first failure of an ever-advancing Wehrmacht that Hitler received news of Japan's Pearl Harbor attack. Despite being a Japanese ally, Hitler hadn't been informed about the assault, and though he'd verbally claimed that he would join Japan if it had declared war on the United States, he was under no obligation to do so. A formal treaty with Japan hadn't been signed. Hitler could have easily allowed Japan to fight its own war while he focused on dominating Europe. After all, it wasn't like the US was going to rush into war with Germany due to the attacks. American anger was focused on Japan, with Germany being seen as somewhat inconsequential by the American public. In fact,
Yeah, I heard that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a big, I don't know even how to say, lockdown on Japanese in America, because there was this thing camps, concentration camps for Japanese, because basically all the Japanese in America were considered as spies back then. So, man, war is ruthless, man.
Little as 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, 75% of Americans were against war with Germany. That threat was across a vast ocean, and although Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, understood the genuine threat that Hitler posed, he knew he couldn't declare war against Germany with the public sentiment against such a declaration being so high. If Hitler had just kept his mouth shut and let the US and Japan fight, FDR would have needed to figure out some other way to get the US involved against the Nazis. In the end, he didn't need an excuse. Delighted by Japan's aggression against the US, Hitler hastily set about rewriting a speech he intended to give to the Reichstag on December 10th. Delayed by a day, that speech ended up including a long-winded rant against FDR before Hitler made it official. Germany declared war on the US. Adolf Hitler had greater ambitions for the United States than many realized at the time. Foolishly believing that Japan's attack would divert resources out of the European theater to deal with the looming Japanese threat, Hitler felt safe in throwing the Nazis' weight into a war with America. After all, he'd believed that the fight would come sooner or later way back in the 1920s. In his second book, written in 1928 but not published until 1961, Hitler declared that strengthening Germany so it was ready for war with the US was one of the key goals of the Nazi movement. Part of his reasoning was that the US presented one of the larger threats to his vision of world domination. America was huge. It had a
And again, people, just ordinary people, are used as a material for achieving the goals of the guys who are on the top, man. And it was like that always. It will be like that always. And this is very unfortunate, and this is very sad. I don't know, like, why it is in human nature like that.
massive population far beyond those who lived in Germany and Austria. In taking Europe, Hitler believed that he could even out the numbers in preparation for an eventual war against the US that would see Nazi Europe combine its might to fight the American foe. After all, the United States is about 28 times the size of Germany. Lifting Germany off the map, it could fit inside California alone, taking up only 85% of the state and leaving plenty of room to spare. Hitler didn't necessarily fear America's greater size. His conquest of Europe would even things up, at least in the personnel department. He envied that size because he had a larger goal for the wars he was waging: building an Aryan master race. Hitler saw his wars as a way to rid the world of those he deemed racially inferior, with minorities typically finding themselves in Hitler's crosshairs. The Nazis killed millions of Jewish and Romani people during World War II and would have turned their attention to other minorities, specifically because Hitler wanted to eliminate those people from the gene pool to ensure they couldn't corrupt what he saw as the development of a new race of supermen. In the United States, Hitler saw a perfect, quote, breeding ground, for want of a better term, for the development of that master race. To him, America's size didn't just make it a threat, it made it a place where Hitler could gain the resources he needed to further the racist ideology that fueled everything he did. It's in this desire that we start to see Hitler's true intentions for declaring war against the United States when he did. He believed he was seizing an opportunity to attack the United States when it was at its weakest. His cooperation with Japan
What was he even thinking, man? He was not able to like attack the Great Britain, right? He was not able to conquer the small island of Great Britain, and he was thinking that he will somehow organize army and like attack USA, right? Man, the guy was not mad. He was like out of touch with reality, literally. Thank God to that, man, because we don't need these kind of people in our environment, right? They're just bad.
combined with the dominant stance he already held over Europe, would help him secure a country that could provide the vast resources he needed to further the spread of what he believed would be the world's perfect race. And there's more. Hitler wouldn't have simply used the US due to its size and resources. He also saw the country as providing precisely what he needed to develop his master race: Aryan blood. During World War I, Hitler was stationed on the front lines at the Second Battle of Marne. According to a Cambridge historian named Brendan Sims, it was here that he came across a pair of American soldiers who ultimately made a massive impression on Hitler and his view of what the perfect man should look like. Both soldiers were tall, they had blue eyes and flowing blonde hair. And in that moment, according to Sims, Hitler became fascinated with the United States because he saw it as the
Just a bit of I want to add. Back in the day, during the World War II, Germans were occupying Latvia, right? And my grandma, she was telling me that back in our county house, which is closer to the Russian border, the Germans were like having a party in the local county school, and she said that she like looked out of the window, right? She like, first of all, she got closer to the school and she saw those Germans like in the window smoking, and she saw these tall guys with the blue eyes and the white hair, man, like me, but like taller. So yeah, literally my grandma witnessed those people.
place where he could find an abundance of the Aryan DNA he needed to ensure his new master race could grow. His theory was simple. Ever since America was established in July 1776, it had welcomed immigrants from all over Europe. But these weren't any old immigrants in Hitler's eyes. They were the best and brightest of Europe, and they had adventurous spirits and were the most resilient on the continent. Those intrepid immigrants had spent over 150 years not only thriving in a massive space and resource-rich land that America had to offer, but also had children who carried the blood of Europe's strongest. The US was already on the way to achieving the racial purity that Hitler desired, and the country's legislation supported his theory, at least in Hitler's eyes. The United States was rife with racial integrity laws that banned people of two different races from marrying each other during the 1940s. Take the state of California as an example. In May 1943, a law went into effect that forced anybody who applied for a marriage license to declare their race before the license would be granted. This was to support California's laws on interracial marriage at the time, which stated,
as far as I'm concerned, also black people were not able to buy property in white people neighborhoods. Because I was watching one movie about two guys who secretly bought banks in the 1950s, 1960s, right? That they were black. And this is what I saw there. But I might be wrong, of course,
No license may be issued authorizing the marriage of a white person with an African American, mulatto, Mongolian, or member of the Malay race, according to the Equal Justice Initiative. On top of that was the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially prevented immigration from Asia into the US and placed strict limits on the number of immigrants who could enter the country from Eastern and Southern Europe. To Hitler, this law meant that the US had measures in place to keep out the types of people it considered undesirable, particularly those of Slavic descent, further enhancing America's racial purity in the process. So, we start getting a clearer picture of Hitler's intent for the US if he had managed to win World War II. In a twisted sense, he saw America as a kindred spirit to Germany, a place where he could further his ambitions to create a master race while being afforded the space and resources, both traditional and in terms of people who lived in the country, to ensure that race remained pure. Perhaps that's why he was so quick to rush into war with the US when he wasn't bound to do so. But let's imagine for a moment that Hitler doesn't declare war on the US. Instead, he leaves Japan to fight its own battle, leaving FDR unable to find a reason to take the war to Germany. As a result, Hitler could refocus his efforts on the Soviet Union, taking the rest of Europe, including Britain and its navy, before returning to attack Moscow with more well-equipped troops than he deployed during his first attempt. Hitler wins the European theater, and now, with Europe under his complete control, he can turn his attention to the US, the land of pure Aryan blood that is integral to his desire to create a master race. What would his plan have been then? Officially, there was no plan. At least that's according to the man himself. In early 1941, Life magazine sent John Cudahy to Germany to report on what was happening in the country as it was in the process of steamrolling over Europe. Cudahy managed to secure a one-on-one interview with Hitler, who was quick to turn the session into an opportunity for him to deliver a message to America. At first, Hitler appeared to send a warning to his American interviewer. He pointed out that convoys being sent from any nation to a country against which he was fighting signified an act of war. Hitler then pointed out that America was sending such convoys to Britain, but alas, he had no intention of responding with violence at the time. Cudahy pushed the issue. He claimed that the majority of Americans supported going to war with Germany because they believed that the Nazi threat would not be contained to Europe. That wasn't technically true, as we revealed earlier when pointing out that 75% of Americans didn't want war with Germany just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Still, Cudahy was at least communicating what American leadership felt. When Europe fell, the US would be next. According to Cudahy, Hitler dismissed the notion, even laughing at the thought of launching an invasion against America.
Guys, if you enjoy my content, don't forget to like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Important, comment your thoughts below the video. I love it, I read it, and I respond as much as possible. So thank you.
Speaking through a translator, Hitler claimed that the very thought of invading the United States was as fantastic as an invasion of the moon. It simply couldn't and wouldn't happen. Hitler even hinted at his opinion of Americans by telling Cudahy that he believed that American people were too intelligent and had too much good sense to think that such an invasion could happen. After all, how would the logistics of such an assault work? Hitler argued. Germany would have to move millions of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean just to get a foothold in the United States, with those troops likely to be met by America's Navy and bombarded throughout the journey. A logical argument. Cuddy's interviews moved on to cover issues related to the economy. He explained to Hitler that many Americans were also worried about what a Nazi victory in Europe would mean for the global economy, especially with Germany controlling so many resources. Plus, the US was aware of the labor camps that Germany had set up, with some believing the economic advantages of such cheap labor would be akin to the advantage the US had when it used slave labor. Again, Hitler eased American fears throughout the interview. He claimed that working conditions were so difficult in Germany right now because of the war. When he had completed his conquest, improving those conditions, at least for the German people, would be his priority. And once he achieved that, his vision for the post-World War II economy would be one in which Germany traded goods for goods. He highlighted an example too. The Balkan states could trade their agricultural stock for the industrial and commercial goods Germany created. The US wouldn't even be affected. After all, it was too much trouble for them to ship such goods into Europe anyway. The interview painted a picture of Hitler as a man who viewed the United States as inconsequential to his conquest of Europe. Not in the sense that they weren't a threat, more so in that he believed America had no interest in halting what he was doing and would not be affected by it anyway. He claimed Germany wasn't going to invade the US. The very notion was preposterous. Instead, Hitler was simply creating a unified Europe under his Nazi regime that would deliver peace and prosperity to all countries that fell under his burgeoning.
And that was a big illusion, guys. No peace and no prosperity for sure, because there would be a lot of repressions towards the nationalities, other nationalities who don't apply to his like worldview, right? And nothing good. People didn't get nothing good from the war of this man. And like this is like not, I guess, most wars, right? You just the ordinary people like you and me, we just struggle. That's it. And like the benefits goes to these guys on the top, also as always, you know. So I don't like war, man. I just don't like war, and that's it.
Empire's umbrella. Of course, we know the reality was much different. By the end of that very year in which Hitler gave his interview, he'd declared war on the United States. But even if he hadn't started a war in December 1941, Hitler's real plans were far different from those he divulged during his interview with Life. He absolutely planned to invade. And his first step to launching that invasion would be to build a navy that was capable of achieving the supposedly fantastic feat of transporting millions of Nazi troops across the Atlantic and into the US. After victory in Europe was achieved, essentially ending World War II without American involvement in that process, Hitler intended to invest heavily in his new Nazi Europe's navy. We see hints of what this might have looked like with Plan Z, Hitler's intention to build a navy that rivaled the British fleet in sheer strength back in 1939. Money was funneled into the Kriegsmarine, the German navy, with the original plan to build a more powerful fleet than Britain's by 1945. If all had gone to plan, the war in Europe would have been over by then, with that new navy being ready to sail to the US, perhaps accompanied by the many ships the Nazis would have claimed as part of their victory. But Plan Z never came to pass. Instead, Hitler focused on submarine production, with his U-boats providing formidable adversaries wherever they went. Cheaper to build than the battleships and the destroyers that would have made up Plan Z, U-boats were an ever-present danger to Allied ships during World War II. If Hitler had managed to launch his war against the US as he planned, those very submarines would have likely been deployed in the Atlantic. After relaunching Plan Z, Hitler would have expanded his navy enormously, strengthened by the construction capacity and resources that came with his control of Europe. Destroyers, battleships, and transports would have been accompanied by fleets of U-boats, offering protection during the dangerous Atlantic voyage. Plus, with Japan still in play, ideally, Hitler might have been able to count on the US having to divert naval resources.
That's what I thought also, that they're gonna attack USA from both sides, right? By the way, there's a sick series about what would happen if USA would lose to Japan and the Germany, right? It's called The Man in the High Castle. right? It's like fantasy movie, but still serious, but still it's awesome, to imagine what would happen,
To the Pacific to fend off the Japanese ships. Eventually, he believed he could land troops on American soil. Other hints of this strategy included the America Bomber competition. Started in 1942, the competition encouraged German manufacturers to build aircraft capable of launching bombing attacks against the U.S. However, the competition started during the war's midpoint, when the United States was already involved, and Germany was quickly running out of resources. Ultimately, it produced only 5 prototype aircraft before being scrapped due to the Nazis not having launching points for the aircraft from which to conduct bombing raids. But it's another example of Hitler's potential plans for the US and an approach that he could have considered taking if he held off on his declaration of war and focused on taking Europe before turning his attention toward America. Now let's say that Hitler was successful in his invasion of the US. Plan Z enables him to send troops over the Atlantic, and somehow those troops are also able to defeat American troops on their own soil. The America Bomber campaign is also successful, with Hitler capable of launching a blitzkrieg on major US cities. Hitler wins. The US comes under Nazi control. What then? Ironically, America itself may have inspired Hitler's likely plans. As mentioned earlier, Hitler admired the US because of what he saw as policies that were in keeping with his desire to create a supposed master race. He would have enforced and furthered the country's strict immigration policies to keep undesirable people out, likely while continuing to kill those very people in Europe. And the odds are high that his racial ire would have turned toward anybody who wasn't Caucasian and of the European stock that he felt was needed for his master race. In particular, the Nazis admired the Jim Crow era of laws that massively discriminated against African Americans. In fact, the History Channel argues that these laws served as the inspiration for the far more severe laws Germany put in place to deal with the Jewish and Romani people, making it likely that should Hitler invade the US, he would have made those Jim Crow-era laws even more severe. A racist genocide would have been put in place to reinforce the supposed purity of the American population. If that seems far-fetched, consider this. In 2019, Canada's CBC News website reported on a book that had just entered Library and Archives in Canada, or LAC. Translated into English, the book's title is Statistics, Press, and Organizations of Jewry in the United States and Canada. And inside the cover is an inscription that reads, Ex Libris Adolf Hitler, meaning this book was created for the Nazi leader. Nestled within its 137 pages is list after list of cities in the US and Canada, with each city containing statistics related to the races of the people living in those cities. The book explicitly targets Jewish people, and according to the CBC, it likely reveals the plan that Hitler had should the Nazis have taken the US, the final solution. In other words, the mass execution of America's Jewish population in the same manner as the murders of so many millions of Jewish people in the concentration camps Hitler had created throughout Europe. It's not too much of a stretch to assume that Hitler's attention would have turned to other people once he completed his final solution against the Jews, the African Americans, those of Mexican heritage, anybody who didn't align with Hitler's view of racial purity. The tall, blonde, blue-eyed men he'd encountered during his service in World War I would eventually have been eradicated, and America under Hitler, one stripped of its resources and home to only those that Hitler deemed to be suitable representatives of his ideal supermen. Thankfully, Hitler's horrific plans never came to pass. Stretched too far by trying to fight a war on multiple fronts, coupled with Hitler's tactical inadequacies that were revealed when he was unable to achieve victory quickly, the Nazis eventually lost World War II, and likely Hitler's Plan Z for...
Man, thank God they lost. Thank God they lost. If they would win, probably I wouldn't be alive, so thank God.
Creating a massive navy wouldn't have helped him reach the US anyway. After all, the US produced a nuclear weapon before Germany, and the odds are that the US would have shown little hesitation in deploying that weapon against the Nazis as they did the Japanese if needed. Still, the thought of the United States under Hitler's control sends shivers down the spine, not least because in some ways he saw the country as a kindred spirit. But what do you think? Was there any chance Hitler could have successfully invaded the US, whether through Plan Z or some other method? Or were Hitler's plans for the US doomed?